What do you picture when you think about the Second World War? Maybe you see landing craft on the beaches of Normandy. Perhaps you imagine desert tank battles in North Africa. These are important parts of the story, but they are not the main story. The main story, the one that involved the most people, the most equipment, and the most casualties, happened in the East. It was a conflict on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine. The numbers are not just numbers. They tell a story of human effort, industrial power, and staggering loss. What if 4 out of every 5 German soldiers who died in the war died on this one front? What if the front line was long enough to stretch from Moscow to Chicago? These are not exaggerations. They are the cold facts of the Eastern Front. The statistics from this conflict are so extreme they can feel unreal. They challenge our understanding of what is possible for good and for ill. They force us to ask new questions. And they show that the largest military confrontation in history was even bigger, more complex, and more consequential than we often remember. Number 16, where did the war really happen? The statistic is simple. It is also stunning. Roughly 80% of all German military combat casualties in the Second World War occurred on the Eastern Front. Let that sink in. Not 30%, not 50%, but 80%. 8 out of every 10 soldiers from the German armed forces who died in combat died in the East. This single number reshapes the entire popular understanding of the war. For many in the West, the defining campaigns were in France, Italy, or North Africa. These were enormous and costly operations, but in the grand scheme of the German military effort, they were secondary fronts. The main event was always in the East. The German High Command, the OKH, knew this from their own daily reports. From the moment Operation Barbarossa was launched on June 22nd, 1941, the casualty figures from the East began to dwarf those from all other theaters combined. The initial invasion involved over 3 million German soldiers, organized into 153 divisions. For comparison, the D-Day landings in Normandy in 1944, a massive undertaking, involved an initial seaborne assault of 5 divisions. The scale was simply different. The German command threw the bulk of its land army, the Wehrmacht, at the Soviet Union, and that army was bled white over the next 4 years. Historian Richard Overy, in his book Russia's War, makes this point repeatedly. He argues that the war was effectively won and lost on the Eastern Front. The sheer attrition of men and material was something the German state could not sustain. Week after week, month after month, the casualty reports from Army Group Center, Army Group North, and Army Group South told a story of relentless, grinding losses. It wasn't just about big, famous battles. It was the daily cost of holding a front that was thousands of miles long. It was the constant partisan attacks behind the lines. It was the brutal winters. It was the ever-growing strength and experience of the Red Army. Look at the numbers of divisions. Throughout much of the war, Germany maintained over 200 divisions on the Eastern Front. At the same time, the number of divisions facing the Western Allies in France or Italy was often less than 60, and these were frequently under-strength or lower-quality formations. The best troops, the most experienced units, and the newest equipment were consistently prioritized for the East because that is where the strategic threat was existential. A loss in North Africa was a setback. A collapse in the East was the end. This reality is often lost in popular culture. Films and books understandably focus on stories that audiences in the United States or Britain can relate to. But by doing so, they can inadvertently create a skewed perspective. The fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy was vicious. But at the very same time, in the summer of 1944, the Red Army was launching Operation Bagration. This Soviet offensive completely shattered German Army Group Center, an event that the military historian David Glantz calls one of the greatest strategic defeats suffered by the German military. Your Army Group Center lost over 400,000 men, killed or captured, in a matter of weeks. The scale of the loss was catastrophic, far exceeding anything happening in France at the time. The 80% figure is not just about soldiers. It also reflects equipment losses. The vast majority of Germany's tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft were destroyed in the East. The war consumed material at a terrifying rate. The industrial output of Germany, while formidable, could never keep pace with the losses inflicted by the Red Army and the vastness of the theater. So, When we ask where the war happened, the numbers provide a clear answer. It happened everywhere, but its center of gravity, the place where the outcome was truly decided, was on the plains, in the forests, and around the cities of the Soviet Union. What records from the final chaotic months of 1945 are still missing, and could they push this 80% figure even higher? How has the focus on the Western Front in popular media shaped the political and cultural memory of the war in different countries? If the German military leadership knew the staggering cost of the Eastern Front, why'd they continue to prioritize it so heavily over defending their western borders later in the war? Number 15, could an army really stretch from Moscow to Chicago? The sheer size of the Eastern Front is a concept that is difficult for the human mind to process. At its greatest extent, the front line stretched for more than 2,000 miles. To put that into perspective, 2,000 miles is roughly the distance from Moscow to Chicago. Imagine a continuous line of soldiers, trenches, tanks, and artillery guns spanning that entire distance. It is a scale of warfare that has no precedent. The Western Front in the First World War, famous for its static trench lines, was about 475 miles long. The Eastern Front was more than 4 times that length. This immense distance created logistical and strategic challenges that were almost insurmountable. For the invading German army in 1941, this was a central problem. Their doctrine of fast-moving, concentrated armored thrusts was difficult to apply across such a vast area. Army Group North headed for Leningrad, Army Group Center for Moscow, and Army Group South for Ukraine and the Caucasus. Each of these was a massive military operation in its own right, yet they were all happening simultaneously, stretching resources, communication lines, and command structures to their breaking point. The German General Franz Halder, the chief of the OKH General Staff, kept a detailed diary. His entries from 1941 and 1942 are filled with a growing anxiety about the vastness of the space they were trying to conquer and control. A breakthrough by the enemy could happen anywhere along this massive front. A gap could open up, and suddenly an entire army could be threatened with encirclement. There were never enough troops to be strong everywhere. This is a fundamental military principle, but on the Eastern Front, it was amplified to an extreme degree. For the Soviet Union, the vastness of their territory was both a curse and a blessing. It was a curse because it meant they had to defend an impossibly long border. But it was a blessing because it provided them with strategic depth. Unlike in France or Poland, there was no single knockout blow that could end the war. The Red Army could trade space for time. They could retreat for hundreds of miles, absorbing the German advance, stretching the enemy's supply lines, and preparing for counteroffensives. This was a core part of the strategy articulated by Soviet commanders like Georgy Zhukov. They used the geography of their country as a weapon. The historian Antony Beevor, in his works like Stalingrad and The Fall of Berlin 1945, constantly emphasizes the role of distance. A tank battalion that was needed in the south might take weeks to transfer to the north, traveling over a wrecked railway system. A single infantry division was responsible for holding a sector of the front that, in the west, might have been assigned to an entire corps. This led to a porous front line. It wasn't a solid wall of men like in the First World War. It was a series of strong points, patrols, and areas of contested control, especially during the winter or in heavily forested regions. This environment was perfect for the growth of a massive partisan movement behind German lines, which further strained their ability to control the territory they had occupied. The simple fact of the front's length meant that weather played a disproportionate role. A blizzard in the north could halt an offensive there, while in the south, muddy conditions from the spring thaw, the Rasputitsa, could bring all-wheeled and tracked vehicles to a standstill. The front crossed multiple climate zones. A general trying to plan an operation had to be a military commander, a logistician, and a meteorologist all at once. The 2,000-mile front was not just a line on a map, it was a living, breathing entity that shaped every decision and determined the fate of millions. How did the command and control systems of the time, relying on radio and field telephones, even begin to manage a conflict zone of this size? What are the true, unrecorded costs of simply moving troops and supplies across such vast, often roadless distances? If a similar conflict were to happen today with modern surveillance, would a front line of this length even be possible to maintain, or would it be too vulnerable? Number 14, what moved? The German army. The popular image of the German army in the Second World War is one of mechanized efficiency. We picture columns of tanks and motorized infantry sweeping across the landscape. This image is accurate for the elite panzer divisions, but for the vast majority of the German army on the Eastern Front, it is completely wrong. The German army was, in large part, a horse-drawn army. It was powered by oats and hay, not gasoline. This is one of the most misunderstood realities of the conflict. The statistic is staggering. During the course of the war on the Eastern Front, the German army used more than 2.7 million horses. The infantry divisions, which formed the backbone of the army, relied almost entirely on horses to pull their supply wagons, their artillery pieces, and their field kitchens. A standard German infantry division in 1941 had thousands of horses on its official roster. While the panzer divisions got the headlines, it was these horse-drawn divisions that did most of the marching, the fighting, and the dying. This reliance on animals created a massive logistical vulnerability. An army that runs on gasoline needs fuel depots. An army that runs on horses needs a constant supply of fodder and water. It also needs veterinarians, blacksmiths, and harness makers. These were essential military personnel. The historian Stephen G. Fritz, in his book Ostkrieg, details how this dependence on horses slowed the German advance. The speed of the army was not the speed of its fastest tank, it was the speed of its slowest horse-drawn wagon. During the summer, this was manageable, but when the autumn rains came and turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud, the horses struggled and died, and the supply system began to break down. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was a catastrophe for the German army's animal transport. The horses were not equipped for the extreme cold. They were not properly shod for the ice, and their fodder supplies were often captured or failed to arrive. Tens of thousands of horses froze to death or were lost to exhaustion. This loss was irreplaceable and had a direct impact on the army's combat effectiveness. An artillery battery is useless if you cannot move the guns. An infantry company cannot fight if it has no food or ammunition. The contrast with the Red Army is interesting. While the Red Army also used horses extensively, they benefited enormously from American Lend-Lease aid, particularly in the form of trucks. The United States sent over 400,000 trucks and jeeps to the Soviet Union. This gave the Red Army a degree of strategic mobility in the later stages of the war that the German army, with its tired horses, simply could not match. The famous deep battle operations of the Red Army, where they would punch through the front and drive deep into the enemy rear, were made possible by this motorization. The image of the Soviet T-34 tank is iconic, but the Studebaker truck was arguably just as important for their victory. The German soldier's daily life was intimately tied to the animals he served with. The soldiers were responsible for grooming, feeding, and caring for their horses, often in the most difficult conditions imaginable. The loss of a team of horses was a personal and a professional disaster. It meant abandoning vital equipment. It meant marching on foot through snow and ice. The war in the East was, for the average German infantryman, a pre-industrial experience. It was a world of mud, sweat, and animal power, a far cry from the modern, mechanized image. How many German logistical plans were fundamentally flawed because they underestimated the needs and vulnerabilities of their animal transport? Are there detailed veterinary records from the German army that could give us a clearer picture of the scale of animal losses from disease in combat? Did the mass requisitioning of horses from across occupied Europe have a lasting crippling effect on post-war agriculture? Number 13, how do you move an entire country's industry? In the face of the German invasion in the summer and autumn of 1941, the Soviet Union undertook one of the most astonishing logistical feats in history. They moved their entire industrial base. It was a migration of factories, machines, and people on an epic scale. The invading armies were targeting the most industrialized regions of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, and the western parts of Russia. This was the heartland of Soviet heavy industry, coal mining, and arms production. To lose it would have meant losing the war. The Soviet leadership, under the State Defense Committee GKO, made a radical decision: if they could not defend the factories, they would move them. The numbers involved are hard to believe. Between July and November 1941, a total of 1,523 industrial enterprises were evacuated. This included 1,360 large-scale armament plants, Think about what that means. It's not just moving a few machines. It is the complete disassembly of a massive factory, including giant presses, lathes, and furnaces. Each piece had to be cataloged, loaded onto a train, and transported hundreds or thousands of miles to the east, to places like the Ural Mountains, Siberia, and Central Asia. Along with the machines came the workers. Millions of skilled laborers and their families were packed onto trains and sent to new, often undeveloped locations. The historian John Erickson, in his classic work The Road to Stalingrad, describes this process in detail. It was chaotic, desperate, and heroic. The evacuations were often carried out under fire, with enemy aircraft bombing the railway lines. Workers would labor around the clock to dismantle their own factories, sometimes literally pulling up the floorboards. The journey east was grueling, taking weeks in unheated boxcars with little food or water. When they arrived at their destination, they often found nothing but an open field covered in snow. Their first task was not to build houses for themselves, but to build a new factory, often without a roof, working in the open air in freezing temperatures. The results were miraculous. Incredibly, some of these relocated factories were producing their first tanks, aircraft, and shells within a few months of arriving. A famous example is the Kharkov tank plant, which was moved to the city of Chelyabinsk in the Urals. It merged with local industry to create a massive complex that became known as Tankograd, or Tank City. This one complex produced a huge number of T-34 tanks and heavy self-propelled guns. By 1942, Soviet arms production, now safely beyond the reach of German bombers, was not just recovering, it was beginning to outstrip German production in key areas like tanks and artillery. This industrial relocation was a decisive strategic factor in the war. The German war plan, Barbarossa, had assumed that the Soviet state would collapse once its main industrial and population centers were captured. They did not anticipate that the Soviets would be able and willing to simply move their entire war, making capacity 1,000 miles to the east. This ability to absorb a massive blow, retreat, and rebuild was something that German planners, with their experience of fighting smaller, geographically contained wars in Western Europe, failed to comprehend. The Soviet Union was not just a state, it was a continent, and it used its vastness to its advantage. The movement of the factories ensured that the Red Army would never be starved of the weapons it needed to continue the fight. What was the long-term human cost for the millions of workers who were uprooted and forced to live and work in such harsh conditions for years? How many smaller factories and workshops were never officially counted in the evacuation statistics, and what was their contribution? Did this massive forced industrialization of Siberia and Central Asia permanently alter the demographic and economic landscape of the Soviet Union after the war? Number 12, was it the soldiers or the factories that won the war? Wars are fought by soldiers, but they are won by industries. On the Eastern Front, this was brutally true. The conflict became a war of attrition, a contest to see which side could produce more weapons and replace their losses faster. In this contest, one particular weapon stands out: the Soviet T-34 tank. The story of its production reveals why the industrial battle was so critical. When the German army invaded in 1941, they were shocked by the quality of the T-34. It had sloped armor that made German anti-tank shells bounce off, a powerful gun, and wide tracks that allowed it to handle the mud and snow of the East. The German General Heinz Guderian, a pioneer of tank warfare, wrote about his deep concern upon encountering the T-34. It was in many ways superior to any German tank at the time. However, in 1941, the Soviets did not have enough of them, and their crews were often poorly trained. The key was not just having a good design, but being able to produce it in overwhelming numbers. This is where the relocated Soviet factories come in. After the initial shock of the invasion, the Soviet war economy, centered in places like Tankograd, was simplified and rationalized for one purpose: mass production. The design of the T-34 was constantly tweaked, not necessarily to make it better, but to make it faster and cheaper to build. Details that were not essential were eliminated, welding techniques were simplified, the goal was quantity over quality of finish. The result was a tank that was crude, uncomfortable for its crew, and often had a short mechanical life. But it was effective and it rolled off the assembly lines in staggering numbers. Let's look at the production figures. In 1942, the Soviet Union produced over 15,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. In 1943, that number rose to over 24,000. In 1944, it was over 29,000. During the entire war, the Soviets built over 57,000 T-34s alone. Compare this to Germany's most famous tanks. They produced around 8,500 Panzer IVs, the long-gunned versions, about 6,000 Panther tanks, and only about 1,300 of the formidable Tiger I tanks. The German tanks were often technologically superior, with better optics and higher quality engineering. But they were complex, expensive, and slow to manufacture. For every Tiger tank the Germans built, the Soviets built dozens of T-34s. The historian Richard Overy argues that this production imbalance was a key reason for the outcome of the war. The Red Army could afford to lose tanks at a rate that would have crippled the German army. In the massive Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943, often described as the largest tank battle in history, the Soviets suffered enormous tank losses. But they could replace them. Their factories were churning out new T-34s 24 hours a day. The German Panzer divisions, on the other hand, suffered losses that were almost impossible to make good. After Kursk, they never had the same offensive strength on the Eastern Front again. The battle was not just about tanks. The same story holds true for artillery and aircraft. The Soviets mass-produced simple, rugged, and effective weapons like the Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft, building over 36,000 of them, more than any other military aircraft in history. The German army was slowly and systematically ground down by this avalanche of steel. The skill of the German soldier was undeniable, but in the end, skill could not compete with the sheer weight of numbers produced by the Soviet industrial machine. The war was won as much on the factory floor in the Urals as it was on the battlefield. To what extent did the focus on technologically complex and perfect weapons hinder the German war effort compared to the Soviet focus on good enough mass production? What are the detailed production records of individual Soviet factories, and how did they innovate under the extreme pressure of war? How much did Lend-Lease raw materials like aluminum and specialized steel from the Western Allies contribute to the Soviet ability to achieve these production numbers? Number 11. How many bullets does it take to fight a war? The scale of combat on the Eastern Front can be understood through the logistics of a single, simple item, the bullet. The expenditure of ammunition was on a level that defies easy comprehension. It was a war of artillery, machine guns, and massed infantry assaults. All of these things consume ammunition at a prodigious rate. The numbers for a single battle, let alone the entire 4-year conflict, are astronomical. Let's consider the Battle of Stalingrad. This battle lasted for over 5 months, from late 1942 to early 1943. It was fought street by street, house by house. In this kind of close quarters fighting, ammunition expenditure is immense. While precise, all-encompassing figures are impossible to calculate, we can look at planning documents and daily reports to get a sense of the scale. Before launching their final offensive to crush the encircled German 6th Army, the Soviet forces of the Don Front, commanded by General Rokossovsky, amassed a gigantic stockpile of ammunition. This included millions of rifle and machine gun cartridges, hundreds of thousands of mortar bombs, and hundreds of thousands of artillery shells. The opening bombardment of this final offensive operation ring was one of the most powerful of the war up to that point. Thousands of guns and mortars fired continuously, creating a storm of steel. The goal was not just to destroy enemy positions, but to shatter the morale of the defenders. This use of massed artillery became a hallmark of the Red Army. The historian David M. Glantz, a leading expert on the Eastern Front, has written extensively about the Soviet concept of operational art, which relied heavily on concentrating overwhelming firepower at a specific point to break through the enemy's defenses. This required an industrial and logistical system that could produce and deliver ammunition on a colossal scale. Throughout the war, the Soviet Union produced billions of rounds of small arms ammunition and hundreds of millions of artillery and mortar shells. The production numbers are staggering. In 1943 alone, Soviet factories produced over 158 million artillery and mortar shells. This industrial might was what allowed Soviet commanders to plan operations that simply consumed ammunition at a rate their opponents could not match. The German army, with its strained logistics and bombing of its industrial centers, increasingly found itself in shell famines, where artillery batteries had to strictly ration their firing. The Red Army, by contrast, could often afford to be lavish with its firepower. The famous Katyusha rocket launcher is another example of this philosophy. A single volley from a battery of Katyushas could saturate a large area with high explosives in a matter of seconds. They were inaccurate but terrifying, and they consumed a huge number of rockets. The ability to supply these weapons was a testament to the Soviet logistical system. This isn't just about big battles. The daily life of an infantryman was defined by the supply of ammunition. Running out of bullets was a constant fear. The long supply chains, stretching thousands of miles from the factories in the Urals to the front lines, were a constant target. Partisans behind German lines made it a priority to attack ammunition trains. A successful raid could silence a section of the front for days. The war was a constant race between production, transportation, and expenditure. The side that could keep its guns firing longer had a decisive advantage. The sheer volume of metal fired from one side to the other is a stark indicator of the intensity and industrial nature of the conflict. Are there reliable estimates for the total tonnage of ammunition expended by both sides over the entire 4-year conflict? How did the quality of ammunition, such as dud rates for shells, differ between the two armies, and how did this impact combat effectiveness? What innovations in logistics and transportation were developed specifically to handle the unprecedented demand for ammunition on the front lines? Number 10, did the weather have its own army? On the Eastern Front, there was a third combatant. It had no flag and no leaders, but it fought on both sides, often with decisive results. This combatant was the weather, often referred to as General Winter. The extreme climate of Eastern Europe was not just a backdrop to the fighting, it was an active participant in it. The impact of the cold, the snow, the ice, and the mud can be measured in hard statistics. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was one of the coldest on record. Following their rapid advance in the summer, the German army was caught completely unprepared. They had expected the campaign to be over before winter set in. As a result, the troops did not have proper winter clothing. They were still wearing their summer uniforms as temperatures plunged to 30, 40, and even 50 degrees Celsius. The consequences were devastating. The number of German casualties from cold-related injuries was staggering. In the winter of 1941 to 1942 alone, the German army suffered over 100,000 cases of severe frostbite, many of which required amputation. This is the equivalent of losing several entire divisions without a single shot being fired. These were losses that the army could not easily replace. Experienced soldiers were taken out of the fight, not by enemy action, but by the temperature. German medical records from this period paint a grim picture of overwhelmed field hospitals dealing with a wave of frostbite and hypothermia cases. The cold also had a devastating effect on equipment. German weapons were not designed for such extreme temperatures. The lubricating oil in machine guns and artillery pieces froze, rendering them inoperable. Engines of tanks and trucks refused to start. The simple act of keeping a vehicle running required a constant, exhausting effort from its crew. The Red Army, while also suffering from the cold, was better prepared. Their soldiers had winter clothing like the padded Telegrika jacket and felt boots, the Valenki. Their equipment was designed with the Russian winter in mind. The oil they used had a lower freezing point. Their tanks, like the T-34, had wider tracks that performed better in deep snow. The weather was not just a winter phenomenon. In the spring and autumn, another enemy appeared, the Rasputitsa, or time without roads. As the snow melted or the autumn rains fell, the unpaved roads of the region turned into a sea of deep, sticky mud. This mud could halt an entire army. Wheeled vehicles became completely useless. Even tracked vehicles struggled. The advance of German Army Group Center towards Moscow in the autumn of 1941 was slowed to a crawl, not by Soviet resistance, but by the mud. The mud swallowed trucks, exhausted soldiers, and brought the entire logistical system to the brink of collapse. Military historian and former German general Rudiger von Manstein wrote in his memoirs about how weather was a constant factor in every operational plan. Commanders had to gamble on whether the ground would be frozen solid enough for an offensive, or whether an early thaw would trap their armored divisions in the mud. The weather was unpredictable and unforgiving. It dictated the tempo of the war, grounding air forces for weeks at a time, and creating conditions that favored either the attacker or the defender. The soldiers on the ground learned to fear the weather as much as they feared the enemy. What are the detailed meteorological records from the war years, and how do they correlate with the success or failure of major military operations? How many thousands of vehicles were simply abandoned and lost due to being stuck in the mud of the Rasputitsa? Beyond frostbite, what were the casualty numbers from diseases like pneumonia and typhus, which were exacerbated by the cold and poor living conditions? Number 9 were women just on the home front. In most armies during the Second World War, the role of women was confined to support services, nursing, or factory work on the home front. In the Soviet Union, this was not the case. The Soviet Union was the only major combatant nation to officially deploy women in frontline combat roles in large numbers. The scale of their participation was unprecedented and is a unique feature of the Eastern Front. The statistics are remarkable. Nearly 1 million women served in the armed forces of the Soviet Union during the war. While many served in traditional roles as medics, nurses, and administrative staff, a significant number served as combat soldiers. There were female snipers, machine gunners, tank crew members, and partisan fighters. Perhaps most famously, the Soviet Union created 3 entire Air Force regiments composed exclusively of women. One of these was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, later renamed the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. The women of this unit flew obsolete Polikarpov Po, 2 biplanes which were made of wood and canvas. They flew only at night, cutting their engines as they approached their targets and gliding in to drop their bombs. The quiet sound of their planes earned them the nickname Night Witches from their German adversaries. These women flew over 24,000 combat sorties, and some of their pilots, like Nadezhda Popova, flew hundreds of missions. They were not a novelty. They were a highly effective and decorated combat unit. The Soviet Union also trained thousands of female snipers. Lyudmila Pavlichenko is the most famous. She was credited with 309 confirmed kills, making her one of the most successful snipers in history. She and other female snipers served on the front lines, enduring the same harsh conditions and facing the same dangers as their male comrades. Their contributions were vital, especially in the static trench warfare phases of the conflict. Historian Svetlana Alexievich, in her book The Unwomanly Face of War, compiled the oral histories of hundreds of these female veterans. Their stories reveal a complex picture. They were driven by patriotism and a desire to defend their homeland. But they also faced unique challenges. They had to prove themselves in a male-dominated environment and often struggled for recognition. After the war, many of their stories were downplayed or ignored, as society reverted to more traditional gender roles. The decision to use women in combat was born of desperation. The catastrophic losses in the first year of the war meant that the Soviet Union needed to mobilize every available person. But it was also rooted in the official ideology of the state, which promoted equality between the sexes. Whatever the reasons, the result was a unique chapter in military history. The image of a young woman in a Red Army uniform, holding a rifle or sitting in the cockpit of a bomber, is a powerful symbol of the total nature of the war on the Eastern Front. It was a conflict that blurred all the traditional lines, including those between the front line and the home front, and between the roles of men and women. How many women who served in combat roles were never officially recognized or decorated for their service? What were the casualty rates for female combatants compared to their male counterparts in similar roles? After the war, how did the combat experience of these women affect their lives and their reintegration into a more traditional civilian society? Number 8. What happens when a city refuses to fall? The siege of Leningrad is one of the darkest and most grueling episodes of the entire war. It was a deliberate strategy to surround and starve a major metropolitan city into submission. The siege lasted for 872 days, from September 8th, 1941 to January 27th, 1944. The statistics associated with this siege reveal a level of human suffering that is almost beyond imagination. The number of civilian deaths is the most shocking figure. While exact numbers are debated by historians, it is estimated that between 800,000 and 1.5 million civilians died during the siege. The vast majority of these deaths were not from direct military action, but from starvation, cold, and disease. This was a siege where hunger was the main weapon. The German and Finnish forces that encircled the city cut off all land routes for supplies. The only connection to the outside world was across the frozen waters of Lake Ladoga, in the winter, the famous Road of Life. The daily food rations for the people trapped in the city were cut again and again. At their lowest point in the winter of 1941 to 1942, the daily bread ration for a manual worker was 250 grams, and for an office worker, child, or dependent, it was just 125 grams. This bread was often made with very little flour, mixed with sawdust, cellulose, and other extenders to make it go further. It was barely enough to sustain life. The diaries of people who lived through the siege, such as the one written by a young girl named Tanya Savacheva, provide a harrowing personal account of the daily struggle for survival. Her diary contains just a few short entries, each one recording the death of a family member, until the final entry states, "The Savachevs are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left." The city's infrastructure collapsed. There was no public transportation, there was no fuel for heating, in a city where winter temperatures are brutal, and water pipes froze and burst. People had to fetch water from holes in the ice of the Neva River. Despite these horrific conditions, the city did not surrender. The factories that had not been evacuated continued to operate, producing weapons and ammunition. The city's artists and intellectuals tried to maintain a semblance of cultural life. The most famous example of this is the performance of Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad Symphony, by a starving orchestra in the besieged city in August 1942. The performance was broadcast by loudspeaker to the enemy lines. The Road of Life across Lake Ladoga was the city's lifeline. A stream of trucks drove across the ice in winter, bringing in food and supplies and evacuating civilians. The road was under constant artillery fire and air attack. Drivers worked in unimaginable conditions, and many trucks and their drivers were lost, breaking through the ice. Yet this fragile connection was what allowed Leningrad to hold out. The story of the siege, as documented by historians like Harrison Salisbury in his book The 900 Days, is not just a military story. It is a story of civilian endurance against a calculated policy of starvation. What is the true final death toll of the siege, and will we ever be able to account for all the unrecorded deaths? How did the experience of the siege shape the identity of the city of Leningrad and its inhabitants for generations afterward? What were the long-term psychological effects on the survivors, especially the children who lived through years of starvation and bombardment? Number 7, how do you fight without an army? Behind the formal front lines of the Eastern Front, another war was being fought. It was a war in the forests, swamps, and villages. It was the War of the Partisans. The partisan movement in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union was a massive and organized phenomenon, and it had a significant impact on the German war effort. The numbers involved and the scale of their operations are a crucial part of the story. At its peak, the Soviet partisan movement numbered hundreds of thousands of fighters. It is estimated that there were over 300,000 active partisans, supported by a much larger network of sympathizers and informants among the civilian population. These were not just small, isolated bands of guerrillas. They were often organized into large, well-armed brigades, sometimes with their own tanks and artillery, operating under the central command of the central staff of the partisan movement in Moscow. They were supplied by airdrops from behind Soviet lines. The main mission of the partisans was to disrupt the German rear. Their primary target was the railway system. The German army was completely dependent on railways to supply its troops at the front. The partisans waged a relentless rail war. They blew up tracks, destroyed bridges, and ambushed supply trains. The statistics on their effectiveness are impressive. Soviet records claim that in 1943 alone, partisans derailed thousands of German military trains. Each derailed train meant that a unit at the front did not receive its ammunition, its food, or its replacements. This constant pressure on the German supply lines was a major factor in many of their defeats. The historian Kenneth Slepian has studied the partisan movement in depth. He notes that it was a complex phenomenon. It included Red Army soldiers who had been cut off in the initial invasion, local communists, and ordinary civilians who were driven to resistance by the harsh occupation policies. The German response to the partisan threat was brutal. They carried out large-scale anti-partisan operations, often involving tens of thousands of troops. These operations frequently resulted in the destruction of entire villages and mass reprisals against the civilian population, which in turn drove more people to join the partisans. It was a vicious cycle. The existence of a large partisan movement meant that the German army had to divert huge numbers of troops to secure their rear areas. At any given time, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who were desperately needed at the front were tied down on security duties, hunting partisans. This was a second front behind the main front, and it stretched the German military to its breaking point. The partisans provided valuable intelligence to the Red Army, reporting on German troop movements and concentrations. They also helped to create a sense of chaos and insecurity for the occupying forces. No road was safe. No supply depot was secure. The war was everywhere. What percentage of German logistical losses can be directly attributed to partisan activity versus other causes like air attack or mechanical failure? How much of the partisan movement was a genuine, spontaneous, popular uprising versus a centrally controlled and directed instrument of the Soviet state? What happened to the partisan commanders and fighters after the war, and how were they integrated back into the regular army and society? Number 6, could a single battle decide the outcome? The Battle of Stalingrad is often cited as the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. A close look at the statistics of the battle shows why. It was not just a battle, it was a catastrophe for the German army and its allies, a defeat on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The numbers of men and machines lost were so great that they fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the entire war. The battle culminated in the encirclement and destruction of the German Sixth Army. This army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, was one of the largest and most experienced in the German military. When the Red Army's Operation Uranus sprung its trap in November 1942, over 250,000 German and Allied soldiers were caught in the Stalingrad Kessel, or cauldron. For the next 2.5 months, they were cut off, starved, and systematically destroyed. The human cost was immense. Of the more than 250,000 men trapped in the pocket, only about 91,000 were still alive to surrender in late January and early February 1943. Of those 91,000 prisoners, only about 5,000 ever saw Germany again. The rest perished in captivity due to starvation, disease, and the harsh conditions of the prison camps. This was the first time that an entire German field army had been destroyed. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. The material losses were just as staggering. The Sixth Army lost all of its equipment. This included over 1,500 tanks and assault guns, more than 8,000 artillery pieces, and tens of thousands of trucks and other vehicles. These were losses that the German war industry, already strained, could not easily replace. In addition to the Sixth Army, several Allied armies, including the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies and the Italian Eighth Army, were also shattered during the Soviet winter offensive. The total Axis losses in the Stalingrad campaign, including the battles on the flanks of the city, are estimated to be around 850,000 men. The historian Antony Beevor's book Stalingrad provides a detailed and grim accounting of these losses. He shows how the defeat was not just a military one, but a logistical and intelligence failure of the highest order. The German High Command underestimated the Red Army's ability to launch a major counter-offensive and failed to properly supply the trapped army by air. For the Soviet Union, the victory came at a terrible price. The Red Army also suffered enormous casualties in the battle, with estimates running over 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing. The city itself was completely destroyed, but unlike the Germans, the Soviets could absorb these losses and continue the fight. Stalingrad marked the point from which the German army on the Eastern Front never fully recovered. From then on, they were largely on the defensive, reacting to Soviet offenses rather than launching their own. The initiative had passed to the Red Army, and it would not be relinquished until the end of the war. Beyond the Sixth Army, What were the precise casualty and equipment loss figures for the Allied Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies at Stalingrad, and how did this impact their future participation in the war? How many Soviet civilians were killed during the battle for the city itself, a figure that is often overshadowed by the military casualties? Could a different set of decisions by the German command in the winter of 1942 have allowed the Sixth Army to break out? And how might that have changed the course of the war? Number 5, what did an army eat? Logistics is the science of moving and supplying armies. On the Eastern Front, with its vast distances and poor infrastructure, logistics was everything. And the most fundamental item in any army supply chain is food. The sheer quantity of food required to keep millions of soldiers fighting every day is a statistic that reveals the immense scale of the conflict. A soldier in combat needs a high-calorie diet, typically around 3,500 to 4,000 calories per day, to maintain their physical strength. Now, multiply that by the millions of soldiers that both sides had deployed on the Eastern Front. The German army in 1941 invaded with over 3 million men. This meant that every single day the German supply system had to deliver thousands of tons of food to the front. The standard daily ration for a German soldier included bread, meat, fats like butter or margarine, and vegetables. The challenge was getting this food from the farms in Germany and occupied Europe to a soldier in a trench thousands of miles away. The German logistical system was stretched to its absolute limit from the very beginning. As the army advanced deeper into the Soviet Union, the supply lines got longer and more vulnerable. The reliance on horse-drawn transport for infantry divisions, as mentioned earlier, made the problem even worse. A horse also needs to eat. In fact, a horse consumes about 10 times the weight in fodder as a man does in food. So for every supply wagon of food for the soldiers, you needed many more wagons of fodder for the horses pulling the supplies. It was a logistical nightmare. As a result, both armies resorted to living off the land. The German army had an explicit policy of foraging and requisitioning food from the local population. This was part of a calculated plan, often called the hunger plan, designed to feed the army at the expense of the Soviet people. This had devastating consequences for civilians, contributing to widespread famine in the occupied territories. The Red Army faced similar logistical challenges, especially in the early stages of the war when so much agricultural land was lost. The Soviet state implemented a brutal system of food collection from collective farms to feed the army and the factory workers. The rations for everyone were tight. The American Lend-Lease program played a crucial role here as well. The U.S. sent millions of tons of food to the Soviet Union, including canned meat, flour, and sugar. This aid was vital in helping the Soviet Union to survive the critical years of 1942 and 1943. The canned meat, known as Spam to American soldiers, was often referred to as Roosevelt sausage by Red Army soldiers. The historian Alex J.K. has written about the economic and logistical planning behind the invasion. He demonstrates that the German leadership was fully aware that they did not have the logistical capacity to supply their army for a long war, and that living off the land was a core part of their strategy from the start. The war on the Eastern Front was not just a military conflict, it was a battle for resources. And the most basic resource of all was food. The control of the agricultural heartland of Ukraine was a major strategic objective for both sides. What was the total tonnage of food delivered through the Lend-Lease program, and what percentage of the Red Army's total caloric intake did it represent? Are there detailed records of how much food the German army successfully requisitioned from occupied territories versus how much they had to ship from Germany? How did malnutrition and food-related illnesses affect the combat performance of soldiers on both sides, especially during long periods of static warfare? Number 4, how many villages simply disappeared? The war on the Eastern Front was not just fought between armies, it was fought against the land itself and the people who lived on it. Both sides practiced a scorched earth policy at different times during the conflict. This meant deliberately destroying anything that might be of use to the enemy as an army retreated. This included buildings, roads, bridges, and, most tragically, entire villages. The statistics on this destruction are a measure of the war's total and unforgiving nature. When the Red Army was retreating in 1941, the Soviet government ordered the destruction of any infrastructure or industrial assets that could not be evacuated. The goal was to leave nothing for the invaders. This included destroying factories, flooding mines, and tearing up railway tracks. The Dnieper Dam, one of the great industrial projects of the Soviet era, was blown up by the retreating Red Army, causing a massive flood. As the tide of the war turned, it was the German army that was in retreat. From 1943 onwards, they implemented a systematic scorched earth policy as they were pushed back towards Germany. Their orders were to destroy everything. They blew up bridges, poisoned wells, and burned towns and villages to the ground. This was done for two reasons: to slow down the advancing Red Army and to deny them any shelter or resources. It was a policy of deliberate and total destruction. The numbers are difficult to verify precisely, but Soviet post-war assessments claimed that over 1,700 towns and 70,000 villages were completely or partially destroyed in the territories that had been occupied. This represents a level of devastation that is hard to picture. Millions of people were left homeless, forced to live in dugouts or ruins. The rich agricultural land of Ukraine and Western Russia was laid to waste. One of the most infamous examples of this policy was the destruction of the city of Novgorod by the retreating German forces in 1944. The city, one of the oldest and most historic in Russia, was systematically destroyed. Its ancient churches and monuments were blown up. The writer and journalist Vasily Grossman traveled with the Red Army as it advanced, and his notebooks, collected in works like A Writer at War, document this trail of destruction. He describes seeing mile after mile of burned out villages and ruined cities, a landscape that had been deliberately erased. This policy had a profound effect on the nature of the fighting. For the soldiers of the Red Army advancing west, the sight of their devastated homeland fueled a desire for revenge. It made the final battles of the war particularly brutal. The destruction was not just a byproduct of the war, it was a weapon of war. It was intended to break the will of the civilian population and to cripple the enemy's ability to wage war. The legacy of this destruction lasted for decades as the Soviet Union had to embark on a colossal task of reconstruction after the war. Can satellite imagery and archaeological surveys today help us to map the full extent of the destroyed villages and verify the post-war claims? How many of the cultural artifacts and historical treasures destroyed in cities like Novgorod and Kiev were lost forever, and how many have been recovered or restored? What was the long-term environmental impact of this widespread destruction, including the poisoning of wells and the burning of vast tracts of forest? Number 3. Who built the weapons? The industrial production numbers of the Eastern Front are staggering, but behind every tank, every plane, and every shell, there were human hands. The story of the Soviet war economy is not just about machines, it is about the people who operated them under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The statistics on the labor force that powered the Soviet war machine reveal a society totally mobilized for war. With millions of men drafted into the Red Army, the Soviet Union faced a massive labor shortage. The factories, especially the newly relocated ones in the Urals and Siberia, were desperate for workers. The solution was to mobilize the rest of the population. The workforce in the armaments factories came to be dominated by 3 groups: women, teenagers, and elderly men. By the middle of the war, women made up more than half of the industrial workforce in the Soviet Union. In some sectors like light industry, the figure was over 80%. These were not just clerical or support roles. Women were working as welders, machine operators, and assembly line workers in tank and aircraft factories. They were doing physically demanding and dangerous jobs that had previously been done almost exclusively by men. The historian Roger R. Rees has written about this massive shift in the labor force, noting that it was essential to the Soviet war effort. The teenagers were another crucial part of the workforce. Boys and girls as young as 12 or 13 were brought into the factories. They often worked the same long shifts as the adults, sometimes standing on wooden boxes to reach the controls of the machines. The state lowered the age of conscripted labor to 14. Their contribution was immense, but it came at the cost of their education and their childhood. Working conditions in these factories were brutal. The working day was extended to 11 hours, 6 or 7 days a week. Vacations were canceled. Discipline was harsh, with penalties for being late or for producing substandard work. The factories themselves were often hastily constructed, poorly heated, and unsafe. The workers lived in overcrowded barracks or crude huts on starvation rations. The primary motivation was not pay, but patriotism and the knowledge that the weapons they were building were desperately needed at the front. The slogan, "Everything for the front, everything for victory," was a daily reality. This total mobilization of the civilian population was a key reason why the Soviet Union was able to outproduce Germany in key categories of weapons. While the German war economy did not move to a state of total war until later in the conflict, the Soviet Union was there from 1941. Every part of society was geared towards the single goal of military production. The human cost of this effort was enormous in terms of health, well-being, and lives lost to accidents and exhaustion. But it was this relentless round-the-clock labor that ultimately armed the Red Army for its push to victory. What are the detailed statistics on workplace accidents, malnutrition, and mortality rates among the civilian workers in the war factories? How did the massive influx of women and young people into heavy industry permanently change Soviet society and gender roles after the war? Are there surviving personal diaries or letters from these factory workers that could give us a more intimate understanding of their daily lives and motivations? Number two, what was the demographic price of victory? The Soviet Union was on the winning side of the war, but the victory came at a price that is almost impossible to comprehend. The demographic impact of the war on the Soviet Union was a catastrophe from which the country took generations to recover. The total number of deaths is the most cited statistic, but the way those deaths were distributed across the population created a deep and lasting wound. The most commonly accepted figure for total Soviet deaths in the war is around 27 million. This number includes both military and civilian deaths. It is a number so large that it loses its meaning. To put it in context, it is as if the entire population of Texas today, or the entire population of Australia, simply vanished. Of these 27 million, it is estimated that about 8.7 million were military deaths. The rest, the majority, were civilians who died due to military action, starvation, disease, and the brutal occupation policies. But the most profound demographic statistic is the gender imbalance that the war created. The vast majority of the military casualties were men, specifically young men who were of fighting age. This meant that after the war, there was a massive shortage of men in the Soviet Union. The 1959 Soviet census, taken nearly 15 years after the war ended, still showed the deep scars. In the age group of people who would have been in their late 30s and 40s, there were drastically fewer men than women. For every 100 women in this age cohort, there were only about 60 or 70 men. This had profound social consequences. A whole generation of women who came to be known as the war widows had lost their husbands or were unable to find partners. Many of them had to raise children alone while also working to rebuild the shattered country. The family structure was fundamentally altered. The demographic imbalance also had long-term economic effects, creating labor shortages in certain sectors. The birth dearth during the war years created a demographic echo, a smaller generation that would be followed by another smaller generation. The historian Catherine Meredal, in her book Ivan's War, explores the human experience of the Soviet soldier. She writes about how the state demanded this incredible sacrifice from its people. The victory was a source of immense national pride, but it was a pride tinged with an almost unimaginable sense of loss. Every family in the Soviet Union was touched by the war. Almost everyone had lost a father, a son, a brother, or a husband. The memory of this loss became a central part of the Soviet and post-Soviet identity. The demographic wound was so deep that its effects can still be traced in the population pyramids of Russia and other former Soviet republics today. How did the severe post-war gender imbalance affect marriage patterns, family structures, and the social status of women in the long term? What are the regional demographic breakdowns, and which republics of the Soviet Union suffered the most disproportionate population losses? Can modern demographic modeling give us a clearer picture of what the population of the Soviet Union would look like today if the war had not happened? Number one, how many prisoners of war never came home? Of all the statistics from the Eastern Front, the fate of the prisoners of war is perhaps the most grim. For soldiers on both sides, being captured by the enemy was often a death sentence. The policies and conditions in the prisoner of war camps were so harsh that the mortality rates were astronomically high. This was not a consequence of battle, but a reality of captivity. The numbers are shocking. During the course of the war, the German army captured approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers. Of this number, it is estimated that around 3.3 million died in German captivity. This is a mortality rate of over 57%. The majority of these deaths occurred in the first year of the war, in the winter of 1941 to 1942. The captured Red Army soldiers were held in massive, overcrowded, open-air camps with little or no shelter, food, or medical care. Right? They died in their hundreds of thousands from starvation, disease, and exposure. The German army was unprepared for and unwilling to care for the huge number of prisoners they took in the opening months of the war. The fate of German prisoners of war in Soviet hands was also terrible. The Red Army captured approximately 3.1 million German soldiers. Of this number, it is estimated that over 1 million died in captivity, a mortality rate of around 35%. The conditions in the Soviet POW camps were also extremely harsh, with inadequate food, shelter, and medical supplies. The high death rate was a result of the general devastation and poverty of the Soviet Union, as well as a policy of deliberate neglect and retribution for the destruction the German army had caused. These numbers stand in stark contrast to the experience of prisoners of war on the Western Front. The mortality rate for British and American prisoners in German camps was around 4%. The mortality rate for German prisoners in British or American camps was less than 1%. The war in the East was fought by a different set of rules or by no rules at all. The protections of international conventions like the Geneva Convention were largely ignored by both sides. The historian Christian Streit, in his work Keine Kameraden, No Comrades, was one of the first to systematically document the fate of Soviet prisoners of war in German hands. He showed that their treatment was a matter of deliberate policy, not just accidental neglect. The prisoners were seen as subhuman and their lives as expendable. The story of the prisoners who did survive is one of incredible endurance. The German prisoners who were captured at Stalingrad and survived were held for many years after the war, working as forced labor to help rebuild the country they had destroyed. The last of them did not return to Germany until the mid-1950s. For millions of families on both sides, the war did not end in 1945. It ended with a letter, years later, saying that a loved one had died in a camp, or it never ended at all, with millions of men simply listed as missing, presumed dead. What are the precise numbers of prisoners from other Allied nations like Romania, Hungary, and Italy who died in Soviet captivity? How many Soviet prisoners of war who survived German captivity were then treated as traitors by their own government upon their return to the Soviet Union? Are there still undiscovered mass graves near the sites of former POW camps that could provide more information about the true scale of the mortality?